Gender egalitarianism has not been created out of thin air within the Islamic milieu. We are recovering that from foundational Islamic texts. I think the stronger argument would be that notions of patriarchy are actually being imported from the outside. The Quran makes no reference to the rib, makes no reference to the woman being created from Adam in any way. There is actually equal and simultaneous creation of the male and the female.
You're listening to Wise Women with Daisy Khan, where faith rolls up its sleeves as a force for good and where women define the future with wisdom and wonder. I'm Daisy Khan. Kindly subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Welcome to a new series, The Muslim Women Project, where I feature 100 Muslim women of power and authority, shaping their destiny, community, and society at large. On this International Women's Day, we honor the intelligence and moral courage of women across the world. But today is not about celebration. It's really about accountability. Across the globe, we are witnessing failed moral and political leadership, overwhelmingly led by men, promoting endless wars, giving cover to powerful men who have destroyed the lives of countless girls and women. So, this is not merely political failure. It's really a moral failure. To find some answers about leadership, I turn to my scripture, the Quran, and notice something striking. God chose many women to lead important missions. And many of these women were often the unexpected, the overlooked, single women, widowed women, separated women, childless women. Then God goes on to show us two striking models of leadership. The Pharaoh, arrogant, violent, intoxicated by power, who targets the vulnerable, the women, children, so he can protect his dominance at all costs. And the other model is Queen of Sheba, Al-Malika Bilqis. She is a political leader described with intellectual depth and strategic wisdom. She consults her advisors. She doesn't want to go to war against Solomon. She prioritizes the welfare of her people. She chooses negotiation over war. And the message in the Quran is striking. Gender does not determine leadership quality. Character does. Because you see, the Pharaoh had power, which he abused. But Sheba also had power, which she used to prevent suffering. So when powerful men exploit girls with zero consequences, they resemble the Pharaoh more than they can even realize. And when institutions protect them instead of children and women, they repeat the same ancient pattern that is mentioned in the Quran. And when women lead with integrity, transparency, and consultation, what are they doing? They're following the path of not only Sheba, but countless women who have been mentioned in the scriptures, who rescued prophets, they advised rulers, they issued legal opinions, they taught scholars, they debated publicly, they transmitted secret knowledge everywhere, they healed the wounded, they stood in battle when necessary. And their contributions were not peripheral, they were central. So yet, over time, their stories got buried. But that erasure has consequences. When young Muslim women grow up without role models, within their own tradition, cynicism grows. And when Western audiences constantly hear only narratives of oppression and stereotypes, Islamophobia gets calcified. So correcting the record is not defensive. And calling out hypocrisy is definitely not political. It really is a moral necessity. Today, if we condemn trafficking in one culture, we must condemn it in all cultures. If we condemn forced marriages, we must condemn forced sexual exploitation. If we demand accountability abroad, we must demand it at home also. Otherwise, our outrage is selective. So on this International Women's Day, I think people of faith must demand more. We cannot shield the powerful while children carry lifelong trauma. My faith, Islam, has been a source of social change for over 1,400 years. But then, here's a deeper question. If the Quran presents women as moral agents and gives us the leadership model of Queen of Sheba, then how did we arrive at a culture where women's authority became restricted, questioned, or even erased? This is not a failure of revelation. It really is the crisis of interpretation. Over time, scriptures were filtered through political power, patriarchy, social custom, allowing culture to trump religion itself. So, to help us explore how our readings of scripture have shaped this women's leadership trajectory, I am honored to welcome my guest, Professor Asma Afsaruddin, who has dedicated her life to this work. She is a professor of Middle Eastern languages and cultures at Indiana University in Bloomington. She's so accomplished that she was inducted into the Johns Hopkins Society of Scholars in 2019 in recognition of her academic and professional accomplishments. She is the author of 9 books, which will all be listed in her bio, but her most impressive book, from my perspective, is this book, the Oxford Book of Islam and Women. It's literally an encyclopedia, so I'm highly recommending it for those people who are interested in this topic. Welcome, Professor Afsaruddin.
Thank you very much, Daisy. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here.
Okay, well, great. I'd like to begin with asking you a personal question because I've known you for years, but I've never really actually asked you what drew you to this field of study. Was there a particular moment that set you on this path?
Actually, it started when I went to Oberlin College in Ohio, and we had a very gifted professor in Arabic and Arabic literature, as well as Middle Eastern studies. I fell in love with the Arabic language. And the literature that I was exposed to suddenly made me realize if I can read these in the original, then a whole new world would open up for me. And of course, as an observant Muslim, that aspect of my education became extremely important to me. And I realized that it would be very liberating and empowering if I could read the sources for myself to retrieve the actual vision being portrayed in the original sources rather than to read the culturally mediated understandings of these texts, which was filtered through the masculine mind. So I felt like knowing the original sources was a huge sense of empowerment, especially for Muslim women who are always being told about what the correct interpretations are, right, by learned scholarly men. And I just thought that's just not acceptable, because the Quranic vision is actually that everyone is responsible for their own learning, for their own education, and they should, in fact, acquire the tools for careful investigation of all these matters. For me, that was a moment of epiphany, that getting back to these classical works that define our heritage, that define who we are ultimately as human beings, the profound questions of good and bad, of personal empowerment, of realizing the true essence of our humanity, that is something that needs to be cultivated and fostered through the years. And that has to be done through a humanistic education where languages, literatures, religious studies are at the core of those disciplines. So that kind of set the foundation for the unfolding trajectory of my career down the years.
In my case, my activism also began out of necessity for giving women a voice. And I had to go into the Quran myself, but I didn't have the luxury of knowing the Arabic language. I'm so jealous that you can do that. I have to read in translation and then read multiple commentaries so that I could decipher what is being conveyed here. Since you've done such a deep study and you're such a great scholar, if you had to distill the Quran's moral vision regarding women in a single sentence or a paragraph, what would it be?
That actually requires a lot of thought. If I were to respond very quickly to this question, I would say that first and foremost, the Quran regards women's well-being as being central to the moral vision within Islam, and that their well-being is equated with the overall well-being of society. Because I had to dive into a lot of commentaries in the early period when people were close to the message of the Quran as it was being revealed. Their views corroborated what I discern myself on my own, a fundamental gender egalitarian vision within the Quran that progressively became lost, buried, changed, and challenged through the centuries as Muslims became exposed to other cultures and often borrowed their assumptions and preconceptions about gendered roles. And that's important for us to retrieve purely from a historical point of view. But again, for many of us who consciously identify as Muslim, for also our moral worldview.
Why wouldn't the women's well-being be the central focus? She is the one who creates civilization through life, right? It's such a huge, tall order that a woman has to carry. And that's why the disaster that is unfolding, all those girls, their lives are destroyed. Imagine how many more progeny you prevented from coming into this world. Imagine how many mothers you prevented from raising a beautiful family. A destruction of a woman is a destruction of a society, right?
It seems pretty obvious. That's not necessarily the message that comes through in a lot of these commentaries that I looked at from the later period. Up to the time of Tabari, roughly the 9th century, 10th century, we don't find such extreme gendered views that view men at the center of the world and where women are increasingly being sidelined as productive members of society. That view is still very prevalent in Muslim majority societies, unfortunately, because the kind of commentaries we read from after the 14th century, generated during the Mamluk period, dramatically transformed if we compare them with views that were prevalent in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, the first 3 centuries of Islam. The worldview that's prevalent during that time would be almost unrecognizable to a person who came much afterwards, I would say Mamluk period onward, 14th, 15th, 16th century. There are dramatic changes that are being effected. And we do have to understand the historical context when we trace these chronological changes through time.
I wasn't going to get into the history too much, but I've often wondered what happened during that era that led to this. I thought the Mamluks were very good with women. They allowed women to own property. They were not
Yes.
misogynist men. But what happened? Was there a political incident that took place that pushed women into just be seen as birthers?
It was a time of great political upheaval. The Mongol onslaught on Baghdad in 1258 that actually devastated the Abbasid dynasty, and the Muslim world never really recovered from that. There were also the Crusaders who came through and wreaked havoc in the Middle East. What happens is in times of great turmoil and change, when men feel that they can't control the change that is being effected in their societies from outside, right? Their societies are under siege by vicious invaders. And so the Mongol onslaughts in the Muslim world actually continued through the 13th and 14th centuries. If we read the works of Ibn Taymiyyah, we get very much a sense of that paranoia during that period. And Ibn Taymiyyah has had very conservative views about women, as did other Mamluk scholars, about how women should consciously restrict themselves to the domestic sphere. Their entrance into the public sphere was actually a source of chaos. So you don't want to add chaos to chaos, right? You're already reeling from the effects of all these outside invasions. So what you can do, though, is you have control over your internal matters and you have control over the domestic sphere. So one way of reining in unbridled change is to restrict women's activities.
And I'll let you finish this because that's exactly what's happening in Afghanistan right now. This desire to control and keep the imperial West out. You have to control your domestic. So that's why women are being caged.
We also see that in the modern West. Why are women's rights increasingly being eroded? Look at the United States currently. There's a sense that we are under siege here, that all these immigrants and foreigners who are alien to our way of life, the situation from a kind of majoritarian perspective. And so how do we stave off all these unwelcome changes? We have to make sure we go back to what we understand to be our core conservative values. And inevitably, at such moments, it's the image of the woman who holds together the home front. That becomes her primary duty. If she were to relinquish that duty, the conservative assumption is that all heck would break loose. I see this repeated throughout history. I actually studied some of the biographical dictionaries chronologically, tracing them through the centuries, getting into the Mamluk period, looking at Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's treatment of the women companions and how his depiction of their lives change. He becomes very critical of those women companions who played a very prominent role in the public sphere. So Omar, a very famous woman companion, she was a warrior. She wins effusive praise from the Prophet himself for her valor on the battlefield. And Ibn Sa'd records that praise. When we get to Ibn Hajar's biographical dictionary, he whittles that praise down to a very short section so that the magnitude of her contribution becomes lost or marginalized. So it's so revealing when you can trace these changes through the sources and pin these changes on these external conditions. So the easy answer to the question, why is it happening when it's happening? It's because there is a sense of being besieged and a sense of losing control of our own lives and of our own destiny. It's all these outsiders who are determining how we should live. How do we stave that off? Let's get back to basics. Let's make sure the family is rock solid and the woman is at the center of it and paying attention to the domestic sphere.
And that's why you hear so many conservatives say this is a Christian country when they never ever said that before. We all know it's a majority Christian country, but that doesn't mean it's a Christian country in the sense that the Constitution is drawn from the Bible. But that's a sentiment that they are pointing to. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. And so these debates are replicated in all kinds of societies. It's not a debate that's unique only to Muslim majority societies. So I think we should keep these historical factors very much in mind in order to explain why things happen the way they do and why they adversely affect women in particular in situations of political turmoil, whether that's a perceived sense or whether that's reality.
So you wrote this entire book, and you mentioned that there's a need to reread the Quran through a gender lens. For the listeners who may not be familiar with your work specifically, what exactly does that mean? We're not talking about changing text, obviously, God forbid
No.
we wouldn't do that. But you're saying examining the assumptions that we bring to the text, or what exactly are you referring?
Absolutely. But first of all, can I point out that I did not write that entire book? It's an edited volume. So
Yes, I know that.
there are many very gifted contributors to that volume.
That's
Yes.
amazing. I went down the list and I was like,
Yeah.
oh my God, every known Muslim woman scholar
Yeah.
is in here. And then I was surprised my name was in here somewhere too.
Absolutely, Daisy. Your work is so important to
I was like,
everything.
whoa, my name is in the book. I'm in the encyclopedia. I made it.
Absolutely.
Right.
But yeah, when I'm talking about a gendered lens, if I can quote from my own work,
Yes.
but first of all, why it matters because who reads the text gets to determine its meaning and what their own worldviews are important for us to understand why texts are being read in certain ways. So if only men are privileged to read certain texts, then we will only get masculinist views. And they will be skewed in favor of one gender only. Why do we get such entrenched patriarchal readings of the Quran? Because it is men who have primarily engaged with the Quran, or at least it's only their works that have survived, so that we are only being exposed to a certain worldview. But then you bring in women, and suddenly so many more possibilities open up. So if I can quote from myself, Muslim women exegetes read the Quran through the prism of their own gendered experiences. And therefore they're motivated by the desire to generate interpretations that affirm women's ontological, social, and legal equality to men, their intrinsic dignity as humans, and their right to live flourishing lives in accordance with the moral and just injunctions they retrieve from the Quran. End of quote. This is why it's important to have these gendered readings and to recognize them for what they are, and to realize that multiple interpretations of the same text are possible, depending on who the readers are. Women's voices have been noticeably lacking. All we're trying to do is trying to reinsert those perspectives, which actually were prominent in the very early period of Islam. I don't have to mention to you Aisha's name. and other women companions. Salama also was known for her knowledge and learning and so forth. But Aisha had her own school of tafsir. She had a very prominent disciple who actually transmitted many of her exegetical explanations to succeeding generations. So Aisha's voice is not completely lost. But when we hear Aisha's voice, she's often taking a contrarian position to some of the male companions.
But it's fascinating that you just mentioned this woman's perspective, because I'll give you my own example. I once was at a khutbah and they were talking about Abraham's sacrifice. And the whole time I was thinking of Hajar, and why is nobody mentioning her?
Yeah.
Because it was because of her sacrifice that she stayed in the desert. And so I went up to the Imam and I said, "You didn't mention Hajar." And he said, "In what context?" I said, "You talked about the sacrifice of Abraham, but you did not mention Hagar at all." And he said that I didn't think of it because I don't have a woman's perspective. So then subsequently he started adding it to the khutbahs. It's so important because we have a different vantage point. We experience things differently. But there are critics out there that keep
always critics.
they keep arguing that this kind of rereading is influenced by modern feminist theory. But how do you then situate your work within the Islamic scholarly tradition itself?
I ground my own scholarship firmly in Islamic texts and in the rich history of exegetical literature. I've actually been able to pinpoint multiple understandings of the same verses in different contexts. I mentioned Urwa ibn Zubair. He was a successor from the second generation of Muslims. His views are very congenial to myself. He is steeped in the early Islamic ethos of gender egalitarianism. If you comb through this literature, you can recover many of these voices emanating from the early centuries of Islam, both female and male voices, who are corroborating some of the principles and concepts that we take as axiomatic in the modern period, and that many of our critics tend to dismiss as, oh, they are so influenced by a modern European Enlightenment vision, and they're reading this back into the tradition. The good, cogent, and historical argument is they're all in the sources. Gender egalitarianism has not been created out of thin air within the Islamic milieu. We are recovering that from foundational Islamic texts. I'm open to whatever direction the evidence points me to. And my conclusions are absolutely evidence-driven. So I discovered the voices of a multitude of early exegetes who are very close to the modern Muslim feminist position, who are arguing for their empowerment through their own readings of these foundational texts and questioning the patriarchal interpretations, which then they see as something that was added from the outside. If anything, I think the stronger argument would be that notions of patriarchy are actually being imported from the outside. We know that Byzantine and Persian societies were extremely hierarchical and patriarchal. A lot of these notions seeped into Islamic societies and then became embedded within them. And there are a number of exegetes, male exegetes, who are happy to adopt these points of view because it validated their own assumptions about gendered relations.
Or it could have been political pressure, could be myriad of reasons.
Absolutely. There can be a number of reasons for that. The most striking example of that is how male exegetes came to read the creation story in the Quran, where there's absolutely no reference to the woman being created from the rib of Adam.
Yeah, can you mention that, please? Because there's so much confusion about that. I always tell people there's no mention of that anywhere.
Exactly.
Where did we get that from?
It's obviously coming in through biblical sources. So the Quran refers to the creation of human beings from a single soul, nafs wahida, in the Quran. And the nafs wahida, the single soul from which males and females are created, is not gendered. So the creation of woman is not secondary to that of the male, which is what the version in Genesis leads you to believe. I know Christian And Jewish feminists have also challenged those interpretations, but I'm going to leave it to them to challenge that. But what's interesting is that those stories were then borrowed into the Islamic literature through exegesis and through hadiths that have been questioned. The Quran makes no reference to the rib, makes no reference to the woman being created from Adam in any way. There is actually equal and simultaneous creation of the male and the female. No one is given preference in the order of creation. And that's a very important point to make. But if you look at later exegetical literature, you wouldn't know that. If you only read the Quran through tafsir, through Quran commentaries, you would think that story actually does occur in the Quran. Now, there were exegetes who questioned that, like Al-Baydawi questioned this understanding and said, where are you getting this from? It's not in the Quran. But by the time we get to the Mamluk period, these are now taken for granted that this is the Islamic conception of the human creation. And therefore it becomes orthodox, it becomes canonical, and no one questions it. It's only Muslim women exegetes, Amina Wadud, Asma Barlas, and others who have gone back to the sources and said, now, where are we getting this from? It's not in any of the verses of the Quran.
And the difficulty is that the majority of educated Muslims are reading the Quran in their local language. And
Yes.
that's also up to interpretation, how people interpret that. I'm reading the Quran in English. The English language is not the same as the Arabic language. Arabic words have deeper meanings. So I just know I'm only getting a cursory understanding of it, not the full understanding of it. Going back to Queen of Sheba, singled out in the Quran as a model of political wisdom and a political leader. What is the story conveying to us?
The story is important. It matters because, most importantly, there is not a whiff of criticism about the Queen of Sheba's political role in the Quran. She deals with Solomon as an equal. She's portrayed as an intelligent, thinking human being who comes to realize the truth through her own intellectual processes and her moral conscience. I think that's extremely important. And we can contrast the story about the Queen of Sheba to the famous hadith that many like to quote, which does occur in Al-Bukhari's Sahih, about how a nation ruled by a woman will face destruction, will face ruination. Of course, that hadith has been criticized by a number of scholars. It is what's known as a solitary hadith. Its transmission isn't vouched for by multiple transmitters in every layer of its transmission. If it was such a well-known hadith, then there should have been multiple narrators of it. That immediately makes it suspect. The hadith often contains questionable reports about women. How can we challenge that? By going back to the Quran, right? We can posit the story about the Queen of Sheba in the Quran and this hadith and realize the disjunction, the discrepancy in the attitudes expressed towards women as political rulers. And we know from the early history of Islam that women were very prominent in the public sphere.
Yeah.
They were running hospitals. They played great humanitarian roles. They were educators. They were teachers.
There were also rulers, empresses, Sayyidah Hurra. I think she ruled for like 70 years or something.
Oh, yeah. And we've had our share of women rulers through history, but also don't forget the first mayor of both Mecca and Medina were women.
That's news.
But I think history is, in many ways, one of the best friends of women scholars and women in general who want to discover an alternate history to what has been presented through the centuries. Very masculinist version of history. So we have Shifa bint Abdullah, who was the market inspector of Medina. And then Samra bint Nahik or Nuhaik, her name, last name is sometimes pronounced in different ways. She was the market inspector of Mecca, two major cities connected with, of course, the rise of Islam. They were both women. So a muhtasib, as the Arabic term is for a market inspector, would roughly be compared to our modern office of a mayor. Basically responsible for law and order within that society. And we have accounts of, I love this, we have accounts of Samra bint Nuhaik going through the marketplaces of Mecca with a whip in her hand, looking for people who violated the rules of the marketplace.
Yeah, she's the sheriff of the town.
Absolutely. What's interesting is no one questioned these appointments. Omar appointed Shifa bint Abdullah. Now, there is some question about who exactly appointed Samra bint Nuhaik. Was it the Prophet himself or was it Omar? But if it was the Prophet, then it becomes part of his sunnah. It becomes a normative example.
Right.
Muslims actually should consider the appointment of women in public office to be part of the sunnah or a habitual practice within Islam. Even if it's Omar, if he saw nothing wrong with appointing a woman to such an important position, then why do later scholars like Al-Mawardi think that women are not fit for public office? We have to ask these questions.
So let's get to the verses. What are some of the verses that have become flashpoints in contemporary gender debates? Just broadly speaking, we can't get into the weeds of it because we don't have enough time, and that would be another episode. But generally speaking, what are some of the things that we're struggling?
So there's Quran 434. I think almost all discussions about women's position in Islam, and especially the way she's depicted in the Quran, starts with Quran 434, right? And then there's also Quran 228, in which the word daraja occurs, and also the term faddala, which also occurs in Quran 434. So I can quickly refer to faddala in 434. Men are the economic providers for women because God has preferred faddala, some of them over others, and because of what they spend of their wealth. Daraja, which occurs in Quran chapter 2, verse 228. The last part of the verse says, and the rights due to the women are similar to the rights against them. This is talking about wives and husbands, or the responsibilities they owe with regard to the ma'ruf. And then it says, and the men have a degree, daraja, over them. I then did a more holistic survey of the term daraja. Many male exegetes like Ibn Kathir understood daraja to be an absolute superiority of the man over the woman. That's ontological. He actually says that in his tafsir. But the Quran actually uses daraja in a number of places. One important verse says, لِكُلٍّ daraja. Everyone has a daraja, or rank, or status, or degree, vis-a-vis another.
Oh, I see.
So, for example, Daisy, you're much more attractive and graceful than I am. Okay?
Really?
I'm clumsy compared to you. You have the daraja in relation to me. Does that mean you have absolute superiority over me? Because the Quran doesn't say that. The Quran actually says ontologically everyone is equal, right? But we can all have certain gifts or aptitudes that make us stand out in some field or another. It does not mean an absolute superiority. So daraja is always relative to something else. But the way these male exegetes read daraja in that verse led them to think that the Quran is actually talking about an absolute superiority of the male over the female. Whereas if you read that verse contextually, it's clearly just referring to the fact that men, especially in those times, in the pre-modern period, were the principal breadwinners. So the daraja they had in the domestic context only was that they were able to earn a living and support the family.
Be the provider.
Be the main economic provider for the family.
Right. But a woman was providing something else, which the man is not providing.
Right,
So what's that?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So in the modern period, if a woman is the sole economic provider, the sole breadwinner in her family, let's say her husband is unable to work, then of course it would place her in a similar position. Similarly with faddala in Quran 434, it does not imply a preference, an absolute preference for men over women. It again has to do with men's ability to provide economically for their family. In the modern period, we can revisit those understandings because women are, of course, now increasingly working outside the home and they're able to perform those financial functions. And as Fazlur Rahman pointed out, this was only a functional superiority. As long as you carry out that function, then you enjoy that measure of superiority vis-a-vis the other person. But if that function ceases, and in the modern world, we've become much more egalitarian in the sense that women also have increasing economic opportunities, not completely. The playing field is not exactly level yet. We are working towards that. But because women have more economic opportunities, those distinctions between men and women's roles are increasingly evaporating. They just don't hold up anymore. So The point to emphasize is these are never absolute understandings or designations for men and women. It's only vis-a-vis their limited and conditional functions that they carry out in society. I have a lengthy treatment of this because this is something that comes up over and over again. And so we should have very good arguments, again, drawn from the sources themselves against these, what I consider to be really gross misreadings of the Quran, because we're not reading these verses contextually. We're also not reading these verses cross-referentially.
Yeah.
Because Daraja in every context does not have that.
Absolutely.
Fattala, for example, the Quran talks about how we have chosen some prophets over others, but in another verse it goes on to say, but we make no distinction between them. So
Yeah.
again, you may have different functions in different periods of history, but your fundamental status as human beings doesn't change vis-a-vis each other. We're all fundamentally equal. Those distinctions, the daraja that you enjoy in that case, is not an absolute one.
Wow. This is such an important insight. But the problem is, it's really hard to change people's beliefs. People don't have the framework of religion these days of how to understand these things. So when scholars revisit these verses today, what do you think are the best tools, like linguistics and historical context, that can change public opinion about this?
You know, actually, linguistics is going to be very important. The actual meaning of the terms is going to be extremely important. Let me get into the weeds a little bit, if you can indulge me.
Of course.
The term qanitat that's used in regard to women in Quran 434.
So we're talking about the obedience issue, right? So a woman should. So first you discussed, men having authority over women, right? That's what you just discussed. And now you're talking about the concept of a woman having to be obedient to her husband.
So it all depends on how you understand the Arabic term qanitat, Qanitat for the plural. Now, that term occurs also in Quran 33:35, where men are described as, in the plural, qanitun, and women are described as qanitat. The same term, qanitat, then occurs in 434. Now, in 33:35, it shows the absolute parity between men and women in terms of their deeds and in terms of the rewards they earn in the next world for their deeds. So when qanitat and qanitun occur in 33:35, it's translated as referring to devout men and devout women. And the understanding is immediately apparent that it is devoutness towards God, right? So it's obedience to God. We may ask, this becomes a $1 million question, why does qanitat in 434 then become translated by some exegetes as obedience to their husbands? How on earth does that meaning even come up? The Quran does not use the term in relation to obedience to another human being. It's always to God. There's one exception, only in one verse. It's also used in reference to obedience to the Prophet. Otherwise, the meaning is, if you look at any classical Arabic dictionary, for a man and qanita for a woman means being devout and obedient only to God. If you look at Ibn Kathir's tafsir, he actually even removes the object of the devotion of the woman. He removes God as the object of the devotion of the woman. He only retains husband. How is that even possible? The Quran never, ever uses that term in the meaning of obedience to another human being, except for the one exception I pointed out. So the male exegetes are obviously taking considerable liberty with the meanings of the text in order to promote a patriarchal family. So the first part of the Quran 430 clearly refers to women as being obedient only to God. That in itself completely undermines the patriarchal regime. Why? Because in a patriarchal society, women have to be always subservient to men. That's a non-negotiable factor in patriarchal societies. If their priority, like that of men, is to be obedient only to God, it allows them to challenge the directives of men, because men are also subservient to God. It places men and women, therefore, on an equal, level playing field. Each has independent moral and legal agency. And in fact, we know that in Quran 971, it clearly says that men and women are the awliya of one another, the allies and partners of one another, and they should equally command what is good and prevent what is wrong. Can you imagine anything more empowering than that? It's
Yes.
really hard to imagine that. How do we get from that gendered egalitarian worldview to a worldview which allows for men to be the overlords of women, and husbands have almost unlimited authority over the woman? We have the Asbabun Nuzul literature, the occasions of revelation, where every verse has to be understood in against the background of a particular historical context. One thing has always been missing is the cross-referential reading, which is where the linguistic aspect comes in handy. How are the same words being used in different parts of the Quran in relation to different people or in relation to a different circumstance? The meaning changes. So if people, and male exegetes often did, if they insist on one absolute meaning for a term or a word in a particular verse, then I think they're doing the Quran a great disservice, because the Quran is multivalent. Its meanings are multiple interpretations can be generated. This is something I have to admit the male scholars also acknowledged to a great degree. But when it came to women, though, they had their blinkers on. They had a very myopic vision. They had already decided for themselves that the patriarchal world order or societal order was the ideal one, and they had to shoehorn Quranic verses into that worldview. And of course, that was extremely detrimental to the status of women, as we know over the years. Even though in the early period, we find many examples that spell empowerment of women, right? How many people have heard of Shifa bint Abdullah and Samra bint Nuhayk? They've really been buried under the dust heap of history. Why do we not know these names more? Waraqah, she led the prayers in her household, and the Prophet appointed her the imam of her mixed household. There were men and women. Why? Because she was the most learned in her household of the Quran.
Because it was all about meritocracy. Prophet
Right.
always chose the best people. And that's why I call him the 7th century feminist.
Absolutely. So I find actually, as I told you, many positions that are contained within these sources that are far more similar to the kind of positions that we in the modern world are coming to, and not because someone else is telling us to think this way. No, we're coming to these positions through a faithful reading of those foundational texts and critically engaging them. Now, I'm not saying we should get rid of the tafsir literature generated by many learned men. Absolutely not. We should critically engage them, though, and realize in many ways they were the hostage of their own sociopolitical circumstances. Maybe they couldn't imagine a more gendered, egalitarian world, but we can.
Yeah.
So we can engage these understandings and make them more prominent, as you are doing, Daisy. I mean, I have to take my hat off to you. Through your own committed work in the service of, again, gender egalitarianism, you have made a lot of this possible. And you and many of your colleagues are working alongside you. We are shuttered in our little ivory towers, but we need also people who will be able to disseminate this knowledge. It can't remain just within the academy. And that's where I think we need to build alliances so we can actually work with one another to that end.
Yeah. And I'm completely committed to bringing out all these pearls of wisdom that sit in these incredible books that you women scholars have written. Honestly, my hat's off to you. And we're coming to an end. So I want to just ask as a wrap up question, if there was one misconception about Islam or women that you would wish would disappear or
Yeah.
become history, as we say.
Yeah. Yeah, the notion that somehow Muslim women don't belong in the public sphere. Now, I think a lot of outsiders in particular, when they see women in hijab saying, oh, she must be cloistered, she must be so awfully oppressed, and she's not educated and she's not capable of doing anything outside of the home. That couldn't be further from the truth. What a woman chooses to put on her head does not matter a whit. It's not important at all. It's who she is as a person, right? So Muslim women have always been engaged in the public sphere, and that's been the norm. And we have to revive that norm in the modern world. And reclaim it as something that's part and parcel of our tradition.
Well, listeners, as you can see, today's conversation makes one thing very clear. The question is not whether the Quran affirms women's dignity and agency. It does, clearly, you heard that. But the real question is, how do we choose to read, teach, and also disseminate this information? So, Professor Afsaruddin, I really want to thank you for your scholarship and your absolute clarity. And I'm grateful for sharing your insights with us today. And would you like to say anything as parting words?
I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me. I think many of us look for opportunities like that to engage with people like you. I can't overemphasize the kind of work you're doing, and that we have to continue this cooperation so that, as we hope, good and better things will come out of it.
Great. This is only the beginning of the conversation. We'll have you back again. And because we've just seen how many more things we have to discuss and tease out. So I'd love to bring you back. Thank you so much. Until next time, everybody, see you and be wise.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for joining me on Wise Women. If something stirred in you today, don't let it stop here. Share this episode with someone who needs it. Reflect on what resonated for you. And definitely plant one seed of change, however small. Remember, you do matter. And your actions have a ripple effect. But none of us can rise alone. To explore more resources and ways to get involved, do visit my website, daisycon.com. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, because every click is your way of amplifying this message to others. Wisdom isn't just heard, my friends, it's lived. So let's live it. Until next time, stay wise and stay rooted.